Zip, zap, zop. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Great Mondays Radio. I am so excited today to have Aubrey Blanche Seriano, who's the VP of Equitable Ops at Culture Amp. She's a longtime peer and someone I've looked up to and someone I go to for lots of inspiration and insight when it comes to all things DEI and diversity and just really smart thinking around this kind of work. And I'm so excited to have Aubrey on. Thank you so much for coming on to Great Mondays.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. I feel like it's been a long road to get to this conversation.
Well, we did it. We did it. So Aubrey, we first met. You spoke at a conference, and I was in the audience. You were speaking, and how you started to, or how you were framing up uh diversity. This was, I don't know, a bucket of years ago, many years ago, really struck me in a way that was like, it was just something that I hadn't heard. Like, a lot of people were talking about diversity, but the way that you frame it, and I wondered if you could give us just a quick primer on kind of how you think about diversity and just kind of how we got here, how you got here to this role, because there's a lot of folks that are like, oh, this is something I'd like to do, or
Yeah.
they have someone that they're hiring that's in this role.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think probably the thing that I said that freaked out everybody in the audience is like, they're like, oh, it's a DEI expert. And I come on stage, I'm like, fuck diversity. And everyone's like, what?
That was
And
it.
my point is not that like philosophically diversity is not a good thing. Like, I don't need to rattle off the McKinsey studies for you, but I really believe, and all of my work has really focused on this idea of equity as a first priority. And partially that's because I think like methodologically, it actually gets you to the outcomes that I would say we all agree on, but it's 2024, so we can't take that as a given. And but really, I think that a lot of the ways, both the reasons that diversity has been a focus in this field, and then the ways that manifests really set the entire project up for failure. So I think
Mm,
one, focusing on diversity, it's not that I think it's irrelevant. I do think you need to measure representation and things like that. But I think a narrow focus on like head counting and who's in the room allows us to ignore a lot of the structural factors that cause that outcome, right? Like diversity is an outcome.
yeah.
And if we get really obsessed with focusing on it, we often employ methodologies to move the numbers that either aren't sustainable or are really harmful and problematic.
Right.
So, like, one of the reasons I hate the word diversity is because people talk about this idea of like a diversity hire as if like we're hiring people just because of their demographics, as opposed to the fact that they have skills and also they come from a background that's underrepresented. And so, when you focus on equity, you're focusing on the inputs. You're focusing on the process that gets us to that outcome. And I think when we focus on making really strong processes that incentivize us to treat people well, fairly, understand the systemic barriers that they face and move them, we actually end up in a better place. And I find that when you have that conversation with people, it's not only easier to focus the champions on the right things, it's
Mm.
also a lot easier to talk to the detractors and either get them on board or at least get them to shut up.
So then tell me how you've been doing this work. I think one story that you've shared with me previously, is how when you were first brought on to Culture Amp, they're like, great, let's get started. And you were like, whoa, we can't do that yet. It to me is exactly in this sort of Aubrey Lane of, it's not what you think it is. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to explain it to you. So please share so I can absorb it again and the audience can hear what your process is like, how you can overcome or outmaneuver that diversity hire mentality.
Yeah, so I think part of it is being really clear about the order of operations. So I talk about that, and there's kind of two ways that that comes up. One, you have to think about like what's the most root level problem in a business. And so for me, I think about policies and process. The right versions of those need to be in place first.
Hmm.
And that's a bit counterintuitive because the average sort of executive who's saying, okay, I'm committed to diversity, I'm going to hire somebody and, get a consultant like me or, hire someone full time. It's a recruiting problem. And it's not a recruiting problem. Recruiting is a part of the solution, but the underlying problem is that you built a business that sucks for certain people. And I think there's two reasons is one, that's not intuitive, but two, it's actually a really difficult emotional truth to metabolize.
That is hard. That is going to be a hard thing to say, right? Like for people
Right.
to go, "Whoa, I just looking for," right? Like what's the kind of hard thing to do? You're telling me my entire business is not hospitable?
Yeah. And I think so one, you need to start with a little compassion for the folks that you're giving that truth to, that say it with
That's
kindness.
right. Well,
But
okay, yes.
also,
Good.
like, I am really no bullshit with people where people say, oh, well, I want to start with employee resource groups and recruiting. And I said, cool,
Hmm.
do you want to fail? And they say, no, I say, because that's a great recipe for failure. And I find that just by asking slightly pointed questions, you can get people on the same page. So I say, are you committed? Do you want to be successful? And do you trust my experience working with, hundreds of companies on this issue? And so they say yes. And I say, well, let me lay out a full plan and a vision for you about what this would look like. So first
Hmm.
is getting the right policies in place. And then the most important thing you can do is audit processes. So it's not sexy. It doesn't always feel like DEI
No,
work.
it is not right. Yeah.
But like the most important thing that my equity and inclusion team does at Culture Amp is we aggressively audit our performance, promotion, and pay processes by 7 dimensions of diversity. And the reason for that is because at the end of the day, we can't go recruit if we can't look every candidate in the face and say, we are confident that you can equitably grow your career here. We
Hmm.
believe that you will be paid fairly based on the impact that you make to the business. Like, that's so much more compelling. And when people say, how do you guarantee that? We say, here's the math. Like, here's the rigor that we bring to our approach so that
Hmm.
we can look you in the face and tell you that honestly. And I think that if every business started focusing on that, we would see a lot more progress on DEI. But the problem is that a lot of that work is not shiny, it's not visible, and it's not as exciting to tell a story about. And so it requires more work on behalf of the leaders to explain to people why it's so important because for so long, we've started with training, we've started with updating our websites. And so there's a lot of candidates even that will say, like, why wasn't there an inclusion speaker for this Heritage Month? And it's not that that's a terrible question. It's that, hey, if I have limited resources, am I better positioned to only do a Heritage Month celebration, or should I spend that money on audits of your performance review process? And I'll tell you from my benefits perspective, I would rather make sure women get paid than that they get cupcakes on International Women's Day.
I love it. Pay over cupcakes. Um,
Totally.
well, so let's get more specific since I know I have a particularly nerdy audience. What does, and when we think about the three things you said were performance, promotion, and pay, is that correct? Okay,
Yeah.
good. I got that right. So, because I'm the assumption that we're going on is the majority of organizations, but this is why we're here in this world the way it is that the performance promotion and pay are not in this are not suited, are not hospitable, are not bringing people along. What does can you do a compare and contrast for each of those pieces of like, oh, when performance isn't there, but the performance piece of it isn't there, and it is hostile, or the promotion piece isn't there, and then how does that look? What's an example of?
Yeah, so math nerds unite. Love talking to those. I think it's really the math is slightly different for each process, but for performance, for example, one we know that there's been this move to like get rid of the performance review process, which I'm completely against. I do think that a lot of performance is busted and we need to do better. But if you don't have a process, if you don't have ratings, you have nothing to audit to make sure that things are
Mm,
fair. And so, in a world in which I see performance as fair, what I'm looking at is the distribution of ratings between different demographic groups. So,
mm,
if my math is showing me, for example, that the majority of white men are in the top two rating categories, but only, 5% of Black women are in those top two rating categories, then I know that something is going wrong with my performance process, right? Because I have an underlying assumption that people from all demographic groups are capable of high performance. And I believe that they can achieve that, but there might be something wrong with my measurement instrument if I'm not seeing that. And so I also think it's really important, Josh, to say that like I come in and I never tell my clients, this of your process is busted. What I say is that our macro research tells us that these patterns tend to exist. We need to audit your processes to understand whether your business has those patterns as well and what we want to do to address them.
mm,
So it's possible that a company is actually running a super equitable promotion process, but unless you go measure it, you have no idea, right? And it's also important that you don't just do these things once because I've been in companies, culture, we've been doing these really extensive audits for, more than 4 years at this point. And we've had examples where, so we run our audits twice. We run them at the beginning of the process, and then we do calibrations to fix any issues, and then we run them again before we finalize any decisions. And we've had examples where in our first audit, the previous cycle, there were no issues. It was super easy. And then in the next cycle, we had some SKUs that did not look right to us that we couldn't justify. And so we had to go back to managers and show them the data and not mandate that they change ratings, but say, could we have a deeper conversation about how you arrived at the ratings? Could there be bias in there? If we do a second look, would we result in different judgments? And I'll tell you, most of the time, the answer is yes. So
mm-hmm,
that by the time we get to that second audit, it's clean.
mm,
But that's just important is that just because you get it right once as a company, you have to understand that that systemic bias can always creep in. So equity has to be a process and a practice, not a thing you do one time.
mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, right. So let's look at using the tools, like you said, the instruments that we have in order to measure some of these, look for those distributions. Let's actually dig in and decide if we've done this correctly. And then, like you said, you can back it up when you make an offer or you are drawing people in, right? We're really talking about bringing more people in, and you can say this is why you're going to be successful here, because we all know, to your earlier point, that one more ERG, employee resource group, does not a solution make, right?
Absolutely.
That's a way to burn people out.
Totally. And that's not me saying that ERGs don't have value. I
Oh, right,
actually
right.
think they're a really important part of an overall strategy. But to your point about burnout, you have to make sure that the role of an ERG lead or the purpose of an ERG is specific to what is reasonable for it to accomplish. So, for example, at Culture Amp, my, equity and inclusion team is accountable for systemic equity. Our ERG leads and their communities are partners in building connection and celebration of different identities. But we also have very clear role descriptions for what our leaders are accountable to do and also what they are specifically not accountable to
Mm,
do. So
mm-hmm.
they're some of our key mechanisms for feedback to tell my team what's not working. But if there is an issue with an employee with racism or ableism, that ERG is not on the hook to solve that. That is our team, but we do trust that they have a perspective that's valuable. So I just think it's important not to like all of these different pieces. People often ask me the binary question of like, is X good or bad?
Right. Is it good or
My
bad? Right.
answer, probably frustratingly, is almost always it entirely depends on the context and how it's implemented.
Mm-hmm. Can we take a quick detour? How many employees are at Culture Amp?
We're close to 1,000 folks globally now.
Wow, that's amazing. I remember way back when it was teensy weensy. So 1,000 folks globally. How big is your equity and inclusion team?
Oh, so that's a good question. So I run Equitable Operations, which looks after people ops, which is like processes, policies, systems, mobility,
Hmm.
equity and inclusion, sustainability, and our corporate foundation. So we kind of take an equity lens to everything. So if you
Mm.
count my whole team, we're about 10 people. But I have two folks on my team, two senior managers who are experts in equity and inclusion specifically. And they not only work with my team, but they work with our entire people and experience team.
Mm.
So we think about like a lot of the work that our team does is as almost like internal consultants.
Yep.
So a good example, we're working on overhauling our manager training this year. And that project is owned by our learning and leadership team. But, one of my team members is like a core contributor to that to make sure that we don't offer inclusion training and manager training. We offer manager training that sets the expectation for inclusive leadership.
I love
So,
it.
so yeah, it's a very horizontal strategy. And so by telling you how big my team is, I'm not probably doing a great job of representing how many people are doing DEI work at Culture Amp.
I guess I just wanted to kind of put a pin in scale and scope when we're thinking about this, when other people are like, oh, what does my equity and inclusion team effort look like, right? And
Yeah.
and so sure, of course, there's going to be it's a different kind of organization and all that, but at least just something in there. Again,
Yeah.
just a quick
Like
diversion.
the HR nerd in me is like, think of it this way, since I would consider myself like a DEI expert in addition to the brilliant folks on my team. We're about 1,000 people. We have 3 DEI experts on staff. So I generally tell companies like your ratio should probably be between one DEI person for every 3 to 500 people.
Okay.
Um,
That's a
After
fair.
that scale, it becomes really hard to kind of touch all the pieces that you want, but like that's a good ratio. I think if you're really wanting to embed DEI in the way that you treat people and then also sort of bring that forward into your business operations.
All right, so we've already said fuck diversity, but now we're going to get into the backlash du jour, which
Yeah.
is that people are declaring DEI dead. Now we saw a foreshadowing of this. I feel like about halfway through last year when some of those initial efforts coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement, right?
Mhm.
Everybody said, yes, this is really important. And then they did something about it. And I felt like last year was the year where it kind of was like, oh, that person with the diversity, head of diversity just left, right? Like we hired a
Yeah.
person or whatever the effort is started to collapse. And so that to me was the foreshadow of that. And we're like, no, this is still important, but obviously something's not right. And but I don't know, we don't really have the effort, the time for this. And now there's another sort of it's another precipitous moment in society, sort of in the air around the firing of the president of Harvard, and sort of the racial undertones of that, and how that is actually become kind of a banner for those people to say, oh, that's actually not. We shouldn't focusing on DEI is not the way forward. So I'm hoping that this is all stuff that I'm just reading about and I don't even begin to pretend to comprehend, but I'm hoping that you can share a little bit of your more informed perspective around what is going on and why it does or does not matter and how to persevere, I suppose.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to situate like this exact moment where like a bunch of, prominent white or white adjacent dudes are like declaring DEI dead. But I think what's really important is that they've made up their own idea of what DEI is and then said they hate it, as opposed to actually understanding what it constitutes. So I think there's that dynamic, but I think it's really important to situate it in this broader pattern that we've seen basically since the beginning of the civil rights movement,
Yeah.
where for every bit of progress that's made, there's significant backlash because people who are in power, who sort of have advantage in the status quo, perceive an advancement of rights or treatment for other people as taking away from them. Right? It's this very zero-sum thinking. People get defensive, they start pushing back. And so, like, on some level, my vibe is like, seen this, done that. Your shit is really tired. Like, it's very unoriginal and it's not particularly intellectually rigorous, if I'm being generous in my characterization. And so, part of it for me is like, what can we learn from the backlash, but also how do we not get mired in it? So,
Mm-hmm.
one, I think it's really important to listen and understand what misconceptions and actually misinformation is being put out there about our work. And I think it's important to say that there are some folks who are super disingenuous to malicious that are putting that out. But I also think it's important for us as practitioners to own the ways that we haven't articulated ourselves that have contributed to that. Like, I think it's helpful as a frame.
Hmm.
Um, and so for me, I tend to just not engage with people, one, who are disingenuous, like don't feed the
Of course.
trolls.
Yeah, that's right.
But I do think there's a lot of people whose values are actually aligned to this work that often get captured by that misinformation. And so my particular approach to that is to actually ask a series of questions that I kind of sneakily already probably know the answers to,
Yeah.
but get the values underneath the work as opposed to getting caught in like the politicized language up top. So when someone says like, "Oh, DEI is bullshit," I say, "Well, do you think people should be treated fairly at work?" Most people are going to say yes to that. And I say, "Great. So do you believe historically that everyone's been treated fairly regardless of their background?" Again, it's pretty weird for people to say yes to that. I say, "Great. So do you think that if people haven't been treated fairly, we should make changes to make sure that happens?" And people say yes. And I go, "Well, that's actually what DEI is about." And I'll give it to you that that hasn't always been done in the best way, but there's also a lot of work that's been done to make the world fairer, which is what you just said was important to you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you start there, you tend to have much more productive conversations about like the limits of what corrective action should look like, all of that, because people often say, "Well, I don't want people to get hired because of their demographics." And I'm like,
Yeah.
"Well, the math says that there's a lot of really unqualified white men who have been hired because of their demographics for a long time. Why are you not upset about that?"
Right.
And just stare until people have an answer.
Yeah. Well, okay, so here's the pushback that I hear. This is one kind of
Mhm.
dichotomy, which is, well, but not, I don't want to invest in this effort at the expense of the profitability or the success of the business. Things are going sideways for us in tech right now. We don't have the resources or what have you, right? It seems, to your point, it's like good or bad. It seems like we should, the underlying argument is we shouldn't focus on this because it's actually bringing us down in whatever way, right? I mean, we have to bring in a candidate who happens to be a color and maybe they're not the best qualified or whatever it is, right? So it's the business counterpoint.
Yeah, I think like when someone says something like that, I dig in and I say, "Why do you assume that the candidate from an underrepresented background isn't qualified?" Like, that's actually fucking racist. And so people
Yeah.
tend to be a little taken aback by that. But I think, like, let's actually unpack why you think there's a trade-off between competency and demographics. Right? Do you have an underlying belief that people from a particular background are more qualified? I think that is an important conversation to have. It requires delicacy. But I think this goes back to your earlier point about everyone says, "Let's get started." And I think the place we get started is actually diving really deep into leadership's values and attitudes. Because if we don't get on the same page about our values and our philosophies about this, we end up engaging in performative actions or things that aren't effective. And so it's the go to slow to go fast mentality. But again, I tend to flip things on their head with business leaders and say things like, Great, your business is in a tough place. Can you afford to hire lower quality talent?
Right. Right. That's, I mean, that's, I think, a very, um, a good, yeah, that's the flip, right? That's a really good way to think about it. And I think then we can have a productive conversation because it is more about the investment in the change, which you already brought up, right? That to me is really where we start to push on the sensitive area, is that like, this is the way we've done it. It's going to be a pain in my ass. I can't do as much of this work over here if we have to change processes around performance over here to do that, right? And they have to believe and or understand. I think believe is the right word. They have to believe that this investment is going to improve outcomes for both people and business.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really important, especially for someone who's really motivated by like traditional business metrics, is it's really important to talk about valuing the counterfactual. And what I mean by that is that we talk about like, oh, it's going to cost me so much money to invest in DEI, whatever that sort of quantum is.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I'm
yeah, yeah.
like, how much money have you lost due to preventable attrition for people from marginalized backgrounds? Like, how many dollars have you spent replacing those individuals and the institutional knowledge that you've lost? Let's actually do an apples to apples comparison. And what I find is when people actually take the time to do the math, they get what I've been saying all along, which is investing in, effective equity programs and processes is actually one of the most cost effective and financially defensible people investments you can make. So, the other way I say it, especially if I'm talking to a board of directors, is if your CEO doesn't understand how this is a cost savings program, they're probably not qualified to run a P&L.
Hmm. Oof. Oof. Let's let that hang there for a second. Oof. Yeah, that does sting.
But I think, but the one thing is just because you're unqualified now doesn't mean that's inevitable, right? Is that I get that everyone has things to learn, and I never want to shame someone for not knowing something. But I often find that people come to me acting like they're very informed on something that they've spent 3.4 seconds thinking about. And
Mm,
so I think it's really incumbent on leaders to think about the fact that, I work at a business where, the reason that my team has done so well is because leadership, they don't really care about the business case for diversity. It's pretty clear at Culturant because we help companies on their DEI journeys. But when I talk to our leadership team, when I talk to our founders, they're pretty clear. This is the type of business they want to run because that's the type of people they are, that they want people in their business to be treated well. They
right.
happen to also get financial benefits from that, and that's great. But I also want to emphasize that, like, that motivation of just, I believe that I want the world to be a place where these things are true, is a much more solid justification and one that's going to withstand the kind of backlash of the climate that we're in. So
Hmm.
I think it's really important that like we spend a little bit of time on the financial and business case, but if like your underlying justification is like my bank account will get fatter if I'm good to Black people, like that's not the compelling case you think it is.
Yeah.
And so I just want to call that out that like I've never seen a company who's doing, equity work solely for the business case be successful in the long term.
Mm,
So I know how to articulate it, but like I'm just going to be honest that if that's your only business, it's actually kind of better for you to publicly say, this is not a priority for me. And so that's probably the other thing that I think that is a little bit spicy.
mm.
I would rather companies be honest if they don't give a shit.
It's a choice. It is a strategic choice. And so let's let's agree that it is okay to decide that that's not a priority for you. It's legal, let's say, right? Like you and I obviously believe it's something that should be done, but I feel like the backlash is partially because uh or leaders felt like almost forced into it. And there are plenty of strategic choices out there that an organization can decide to or not to do. There's plenty of things that Amazon does and that I don't agree with, but it's not, they have the right to do it. And so you can just say it and say, this is not a priority for us right now, as opposed to pretending like it is.
Absolutely. Like, I don't think it's particularly ethically defensible, but you have the right to make that choice. But
Sure.
the reason for me that that's so important, so like obviously like Basecamp, Coinbase are kind of like famous examples of companies who have done this. And for me, I think it's really important because often companies put out this branding that says like we care about these things, and people from marginalized backgrounds believe that marketing, and they go into those companies that aren't actually investing in it, and they are meaningfully harmed
Yeah.
by that experience.
Yeah.
And so my thing is, if you say right on the masthead, this is not a priority for us, then people can opt out of participating, whether that's as a consumer or as an employee in your business. They can make an informed decision about whether your values and practices align with their values and how they want to be treated. And so I actually think it is more ethical to say you don't give a shit than to say you do and not actually invest in the work. And
Yeah.
so I just think that's important, is that you are practicing like, or you're not putting people in harm's way because you're not being disingenuous.
I think this requires a lot of, I'll call it self-awareness, right? Like I think that is really what perhaps we're missing. Maybe some of these folks that lead these organizations, they don't realize that that's in fact the case. And I don't know. I just find that really enlightening, to go in that direction. So let's then pull all this together in this sort of zeitgeist of the moment and talk about how this kind of work has, it probably has been, but is now more than ever, um, a political debate. It's been divisive and or framed in that way. The kind of the concept is sort of lefty liberal organizations are gonna be hiring more people of color versus the conservative right-leaning organizations are going to be focused exclusively on increasing the stock price, whatever that might be.
Yeah, I think it has become politicized, but it honestly doesn't have to be. And I think it's really important that when we paint issues like this on the left right kind of spectrum, we're actually also speaking about a time bound construct. So I think it's actually completely possible to generate a conservative argument for this work. Right. And so whether that's financially conservative, that like, our bottom line is the thing that's most important, we're going to invest in, cost savings talent strategies. Great. Fund your DEI program. I want to increase my profits. I need to make sure that my employee base reflects and understands the consumer base that's rapidly diversifying and globalizing. Versus the sort of leftist social justice flavor justifications where it's about people deserve dignity and human rights. Like, I tend to fall more in that camp, if I'm honest. But at the end of the day, we can find multiple justifications for this work that speak authentically to people from different backgrounds. And I think that it's really incumbent on those of us that are advocates and practitioners that we're able to tell those differentiated stories so that we can get more people on the bandwagon. But I don't think it is inevitable that these kind of issues in these programs have to be politicized. I think it would be incorrect to say that they can be entirely depoliticized, in that politics just means about power, and this work is about power and who has it and how it's shared. I think that's true, but I think the polarization that's attached to the politics of this is something that we can work around, and we have to accept is one of the barriers to being successful in this work, so we can thoughtfully navigate it.
Yeah. I think really we're getting into that kind of very human tribal identity piece of this. That's where it's coming from. I really find your point about politics being about power. It is inseparable, because this is about power from the very beginning of our conversation, where it's, oh, someone else is taking power away from me. And so that is an interesting concession or statement of fact, but it doesn't have to be polarizing. And that polarization is about us being part of a tribe and protecting our particular point of view or view of the world. And so I mean, there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that, we continue to be inclusive, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's also the beneficial thing to do.
I think that's really an important point, is because it's really easy for someone to go, oh, I'm losing power, I'm losing influence, so this is bad for me. But from every direction, we know that equity and equality is good for everybody. Or to put it, the other way, systems of oppression and domination certainly impact those who are marginalized by them, but they are also bad for people in the more powerful group. And I think that, asserting that and being able to tell stories about how that manifests is a part of the influence work that we do to sort of broaden the coalition that's pushing for these things.
Business is powerful. I mean, this is where we're coming together. And that's, I think, for all the problems of capitalism, I think this is actually one of the ways that business can actually be a force for good, because we're all rallying around this idea of success and how do we become more successful.
Yeah, and I think the answer is, I personally define success as a collective endeavor. And I think that's something that we all have the capability to do.
Amazing. I think we'll leave it there. Aubrey Blanche Seriano, VP of Equitable Ops at Culture Amp. You can learn more about Aubrey at her website, aubreyblanche.com, AubreyBlanche.com. Thank you. I so appreciate you coming on and teaching us all about this work and deepening my understanding. It's amazing to know that people are like you are out there fighting the good fight, and it's just incredible. You're such an inspiration. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel lucky to have a lot of help.
Thank you.